Okay, hello and welcome everyone to today's nature seminar. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'll just mention the next few weeks, the last three of this term. So next week we've got Brock Bergserth talking about leveraging human behavioral science for conservation. The week after, we have Joanne Preston from Southampton, from Portsmouth University, on joining the blue dots, how to understanding connectivity across the seascape can inform nature restoration. And the final one of term will be David Cooper, who's former Secretary of the Convention of Biological Diversity, who'll be talking about biodiversity governance, past, present, and future, reflection of the COP16. So do come along to all of those. And after today's talk, we have Q&A here and then drinks around the corner as well. So you're welcome to join us for more informal conversations. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Andy Gonzalez here. And Andy is Professor and Libero Chair in Biodiversity Conservation at McGill University in Canada. And he obtained his PhD from Imperial. He's a Brit abroad. And but amongst his many achievements, he's co-chair of GeoBon, which you'll hear all about today, if you don't know what GeoBon is, and also was co-chair of the IPBES assessment on monitoring biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. So he's been an important influence in understanding the relationship between biodiversity data and collection and how we can meet our global ambitions for halting and reversing the decline of biodiversity. So thank you for joining us, Andy.
Thank you, Yadvinder. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that welcome. I've had a fantastic couple of days here in Oxford. Thank you for coming today. My talk has a very simple question, but I think a pretty important one. It relates to what the science community can contribute to policy and vice versa. And really, this is a call to arms. I think it behoves us to, as a science community, to gather around this question, to work together to gather the evidence that supports the parties that have committed to the CBD's new global biodiversity framework to provide the evidence that countries need to report on their progress. And I think it's fair to say that there's never been more interest in biodiversity data, and the value that that provides to society. I'm going to show you a video here of the information that is accumulated in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility starting in 1980. The fluorescent dots are observations geolocated on the Earth's surface. And you're seeing the green density shows you the number of points at that location, and the spikes coming off the surface of the Earth tell you how many points there were in that location at that time. There are 3.2 billion observations in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. It's a remarkable effort. And what's truly remarkable is that it recognizes the contributions of a whole array of actors in modern society, from scientists in institutions like this, all the way to recognizing the contributions of citizen scientists that are contributing observations to this database through their phones and through platforms like iNaturalist. So that's a remarkable resource, a global commons, if you like, a global public good that allows us and allows countries to understand biodiversity change. But hopefully you will have noticed as it's played that the data can be found and is only found in certain parts of the world. In fact, only 10 countries in the world represent 80-odd% of all the observations in that database. And to a first approximation, that information is 80% of that information is for birds, and the data will lie within 2 kilometers of a road. So there's a huge geographic historical legacy to do with how and who was gathering that data. And that is part of the issue of meeting the needs of the Global Biodiversity Framework, is about how do we address these geographic taxonomic biases. Now, these are observations, these are occurrences, these are static observations where we see an individual, we record that individual, and that information is extremely valuable. But I want to give you another picture about the Earth's biota. Here you're going to see roughly 30 years of information And what it's showing you are the movement tracks of organisms. You're going to see different colors. In red, you're going to see the movement of marine mammals, raptors, seabirds, shorebirds, terrestrial mammals, and water birds. Thousands of observations gathered by tracking data, collars, and other sorts of information allow us to see the dynamic nature of movement in our biosphere. Look at the pulsing through the seasons, the ice extent, receding, expanding, the movement of seabirds and sea mammals, of terrestrial mammals, wolves, moose. That's a completely different picture of the data that we need in order to understand the challenge that we have under the goals and targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And you can see it zooming in now. We're going into, that was the Hudson Bay in Canada, and moving into northern Alberta, where we can see a lone wolf tracks over time. So this is an incredibly dynamic view. And what that tells me is that countries need to work together, that organisms don't understand the barriers and the borders that we recognize that are particularly in the news at the moment, and understand that if we're going to realize the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework and those targets, we're going to have to work on the way that nature, the dynamic relationship of nature to the Earth's surface. And it was in this context that we managed to write a piece for The Guardian that tried to translate to the average reader the extreme importance of what we call taking the pulse of the planet. That video I've just shown you is giving you an impression of the incredibly dynamic nature of life on Earth, and that we need to do much, much better at providing a picture on a regular basis at a pace and scale that's relevant to policy, to conservation policy. And in this article, I gave this quote, which has basically been the spur of all of this work that I'm going to share with you today, that the uncertainty in our knowledge of where biodiversity is changing is so great that even if we achieve the goals, we would not know it. So what that's telling you is that for certain parts of the world, we have exceptionally rich access to data and information and knowledge. But for the vast majority of the parties to the convention, there are relatively, well, at least in the global databases, we have relatively low densities of information and knowledge, which makes it extremely challenging for those countries to rapidly calculate the metrics that they need to demonstrate progress. I fear that if we don't rally around this challenge, if we don't mobilize the resources and the collaborations we need internationally, then we will be stuck in this situation of uncertainty, and we won't know if we've reached our targets. And we want to avoid that outcome, because in the previous round of targets, the Aichi targets, we did not have the benefit of this monitoring framework, this ability to measure, to mandate countries and to ask countries to track their progress towards their biodiversity goals. So for this talk, I have three broad questions. How do we gather the evidence that we are making progress towards national and global biodiversity goals? How do we assemble a global biodiversity observing system that is fit for the purpose of tracking that pulse of the planet? And in my second part of my talk, I want to address how do we apply biodiversity science to guide action to achieve connectivity targets, where by connectivity, I mean the movement of organisms, in particular animals, the free passage of animals through ecosystems, among landscapes, and oftentimes in heavily modified landscapes. So let's see. We have, since December 2022, a new global commitment to 4 goals and 23 action targets that are dedicated to recovering the state of nature over vast areas of our planet. 40 to 50, depends which study you read, let's say 50% of ice-free land surface is heavily modified by people for urban areas, for agriculture, etc. And ultimately, it can all be boiled down to this idea of bending the curve of biodiversity. What we want to try to do is, between now and 2050, is jump off this trajectory of business as usual to a long-term unsustainable degradation of various descriptors of the state of nature, whether that's genetic diversity, population abundances, the composition of species in communities, and the structure and function of ecosystems. And over the coming years, to switch to a trajectory in society that is towards a recovery of the state of nature, not necessarily to some historical notion of pristine nature, but to some relationship where humans and nature are flourishing together, i.e. living in harmony with nature by 2050. Now, these 23 targets are focused on action on the drivers, on the underlying causes of biodiversity change. And that's crucial because it's insufficient just to measure the state of nature. We want to be able to measure that we're making progress on mitigating or lowering the impact of those drivers. And so in that context, the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, has this very important additional piece, which we call the monitoring framework. And this is an incredibly important component because it's there to ensure that we monitor the state of nature, that countries report on their progress towards the targets that they have identified in their national biodiversity strategies and those action plans that realize those strategies on the ground, in the ocean, or in fresh waters. And so what the monitoring framework does is it couples the science community, those that are focused on understanding biodiversity change, with the reporting process, as countries have to do their reports to the Secretariat of the CBD so that the information can be gathered, aggregated, and then reported back to society to demonstrate progress. So this is the challenge that we have as a community of researchers and experts in biodiversity, is to demonstrate that this process of shifting from a business as usual scenario to something nature, let's call it nature positive or nature in recovery. At this point, I think it's useful to use a quote from Yogi Berra, the great baseball player, who has a certain way of words, would often say somewhat nonsensical things, but with a deep truth to them. If you don't know where you're going, you're likely to end up somewhere else. And I think there's a lot of truth to this in terms of thinking about the monitoring framework, that if we want to understand where we're going, then we've got to mobilize monitoring science. We've got to connect to the modeling communities, those that are gathering information, to understand what trajectory we're on and whether we have the means to switch to a better pathway. So what this scientifically boils down to is something we call the geography of biodiversity change. So we're in a geography department. And I was just talking to Yadvinda today at breakfast about how geographers are uniquely equipped to understand complex systems, about the relationship between society and nature and the reciprocity of those relationships. And so what we're just starting to do now is understand or begin to quantify from the videos that I showed you at the beginning, how biodiversity is changing at global, regional or landscape and down to local scales. And something we appreciate is that biodiversity, different measures of biological diversity, change differently at different scales, just by the nature of the way that species accumulate and change in space over time. We can think about also the relationships among mosaics of ecosystems when we think about connectivity and how the movement of organisms leads to emergent outcomes for biodiversity at the landscape scale or at the regional scale. So if we want to answer the question, how do we bend the curve of biodiversity, we have to have scale, spatial scale, very explicit in our mind. And to be sure that we're monitoring change at the scales that are relevant to action, whether we're a local NGO acting at this scale, whether an international organization may be acting at a continental scale, and everything in between. And for the GBF to work, we have to bridge the gap between our understanding of biodiversity change geographically and the footprint of human drivers. Those factors that are driving turnover in the composition of communities, redirecting where species are going, we have to understand how land use and land cover change modifies different elements of biodiversity that we call essential biodiversity variables, from genetic diversity to population size, to the morphology and the traits of organisms, to the composition of communities and the structure and functioning of ecosystems. All of those dimensions intersect with scale and with drivers that we can measure in different ways. So our challenge is to support those countries. All the countries are committed to their NBSAP, to defining their relationship to nature across scales and in ways that are acting on those targets. You remember those targets are about acting on the drivers. And can we demonstrate that action on the drivers is leading to outcomes for nature that are consistent with what we want to achieve by 2030 and by 2050? So here is an example of what I mean. We recently in my lab, Peter Rodriguez, used Earth observations by satellite, so remote sensing of an enhanced vegetation index. It tells you how green the landscape is and the change in greenness. And we chose an extremely important area in Canada. It's called Algonquin Park. It's a provincial park, extremely important park culturally, the oldest in Canada, provincial park in Canada. And it lies at the boundary between deciduous forest and the boreal forest. It has thousands of lakes, and this area is about 7,000 kilometers squared. And what we want to do is understand the geography of change in this protected area. Why? Because one of the objectives of the GBF is to ensure that we have intact protected areas and that the biodiversity inside those protected areas is not being degraded in the long term. But Algonquin is challenging because it's one of the parks where industrial logging is allowed in certain parts. And so what you can see here in lime green are the areas that are protected, and in gray are those areas where some logging can be happening. Also, this park is exposed to insect outbreaks, which kill trees, for example, or fire. You have seen the news of the fires in Canada. This is a very important topic right now to Canadians. And so what we wanted to show is whether there are patterns of change, of decline or increase in this measure of the state of the forest. And so in areas where you're seeing increases, they're colored green, and in areas where you're seeing decreases, they're colored brown red. So hopefully you can see from the back there that this is a highly patterned function of declines and increases. And it turns out that you can do an analysis and show that there are certain types of decline plus recovery, or recovery plus decline and then recovery again, so slightly more complexity in the understanding of change, and then we can map those as well. And crucial to what I showed you in the previous slide is that we can relate those to the drivers. So fire, insect, and harvesting. And so now for the first time, we have this picture of change in Algonquin Provincial Park, and that becomes potentially an input into a revision of the management plan for this important protected area. And we need to be able to emulate this and replicate this across the board if we're going to respond to the challenge of the GBF's protected area targets. Now, here is an example of scaling from a protected area to the entire planet. This is the type of thing that is at the edge of what we're able to do now. It's at the forefront of what statisticians combined with ecologists are able to do. This is showing you a map, a global map of another measure of the greenness of vegetation. That doesn't really matter what the measure is. What I'm most excited about is that what you're seeing here, the color coding tells you whether greenness is increasing. We're seeing a greening of the ecosystem, whether there's no change in this sort of orangey khaki color, or whether there's a decline in the greening in dark brown. And remarkably, we're able to, for every pixel on the planet at 300 meters, we're able to show the trends, the shift in the greening at that location. This is incredibly valuable if we can replicate this process for many different measures of biodiversity, because this would help us understand if the cumulative effect of conservation action under the GBF is leading to those global outcomes that I was telling you about, but at a granularity that's relevant for action. So that's the critical task that we're trying to rally around by combining data sets, statistical approaches to try to produce this knowledge. Now, of course, this comes from a satellite. This is Earth observation meets biodiversity conservation. And in an ideal world, we combine this information, this knowledge, with in situ understanding. So on the boots on the ground understanding about why certain trajectories or trends might be occurring. So I'm going to give you a very general framework, and apologies to those of you who were here for the workshop yesterday because you've seen this figure already, but there are lots of people in the room who have not seen this figure, which is my conceptualization of the challenge we have. So I've just shown you in the previous map that every pixel summarizes a trend. So in this case, every dot is a location on Earth. It could be an entire nation state. So there would be 196 dots here of signatories to the GBF, or it could be a pixel the size of this room. And what we're interested in is the fate of biodiversity, the trend in biodiversity, whether it's increasing, so above this line, or decreasing if it's below this line. So in a particular location, we understand there may be some underlying causes for a trend, negatively speaking, in the long term, or action, conservation action in case of this road bridge that's allowing organisms to pass over a highway in Canada here, which might be responsible or critical for piece of action that's allowing the recovery of a certain fragmented population. And what we want to understand is how changing the gradient of human impact shifts the distribution of these dots. Because when we generalize to every country in the world, represented by these dots, or every square kilometer, what we have is something I call the cloud of biodiversity change. That every one of these dots is changing over time based on what's happening to the climate, to disease, to human land use change, to the whole suite of drivers that we can attribute as causes for biodiversity change. And so this cloud is, if you can imagine and close your eyes, is highly dynamic. What we want to do is understand globally, in aggregate, the trends that we see today by gathering all the information that we have about the state of nature, from genetics to ecosystem structure and function. And then that is where we are today. This gray dot is centered on the mean or the central tendency of this distribution of change. And we're very worried about those trends that are very, very fast, where there's a steep decline. And we want to interpret that and understand what it would take to raise these dots so that the distribution now is centered on zero, i.e. no change, or above zero, where we have recovery in those places where we have most degradation of biodiversity. This is the aggregate of trends emerging by 2050 that are attributable to conservation action under the GBF. So here in a nutshell, in a single slide, is our challenge. And how do we think about the relationships among places, among ecosystems, among countries in achieving this aggregate outcome that is sort of shifting us from this point to a curve, a bent curve of biodiversity, where we've seen recovery under an integrated, what we'll call action portfolio, a portfolio of different conservation actions that allow us to raise the cloud of biodiversity. Now, as you can imagine, this is a statistical nightmare, because in every location, you have a very noisy understanding of change. Biodiversity doesn't sit still. Biodiversity is constantly fluctuating. and the trends in genetic diversity, population abundance, composition, et cetera, et cetera. And for most areas of the Earth, as I showed you at the beginning, at the outset, we don't have time series data. So what we have to do is try to motivate an investment in monitoring, an investment in understanding change that allows us by 2030, probably not by 2030, but by 2050, to know whether we've hit our goals in this sort of well-defined statistical sense. Now, I want to dig into this statistical challenge a bit. So let's start with just one slice through goal A, which is focused mainly on the state of nature. And there we can find a statement like this, which is to reduce the risk of extinction of a species tenfold and ensure that the abundance of native wild species is increased to healthy and resilient levels. So what we want to do is to assess abundance trends and the risk, statistically speaking, of very rapid declines. We want to pinpoint those locations where that's happening. And then we want to deploy mitigating actions, conservation actions that slow the rate of decline. And then we want to understand, can future changes in those trends due to our conservation action be detected statistically speaking? Given the current uncertainty in those time series that I showed you in the previous slide. And third, whether we have what's called the statistical power to detect if population trends have improved because of conservation action and not because of some other reason. If we can nail this down, then we're going to have this sound, quantitative, statistical framework to interpret the success of action under the GBF. So let's imagine a thought experiment. We can't change the data we have today. We don't have a time machine. We can't go back. We can't start up monitoring programs that should have been started all around the world. So we have data that we have. And in some cases, we have lots of data. We have lots of time series. And so imagine a scenario where management actions reduce the true mean decline to 0, right? So let's say the mean decline is negative, meaning on average we're declining. But conservation action has shifted it, so we've achieved our goals in one sense, and on average we're not declining. Can we detect that outcome? Could we detect improvements with current sampling and monitoring if we achieve that conservation outcome? And what sample size, meaning how many populations do you have to count or how many ecosystems do you have to map, like I showed you for Algonquin, that are required to have a reasonable likelihood of detecting an effective conservation action of a given size? So here is a picture that frames this challenge. So on every location on the Earth or the oceans, we have, in an ideal world, we would have population size over time, and we would have different trajectories in different places. Some of them are decline, quasi-extinction. In other cases, we've got lots of recovery. In other cases, we've stabilized the population. For example, we've stabilized an invasive alien species. Okay, now translate that into growth rate. So you take the log of the ratio between two time points, and you can calculate the fluctuations in the growth rates of our population. And now we have the variable that we're interested in because we're focusing on growth rate. And so what you can see is that we can identify regions where the growth rate jumped because of action represented by this vertical dotted line. That we've imposed some intervention. That intervention was intended to change the growth rate and allow our populations to recover. So what this means in aggregate, here come these bell curves again, is that we've gone from a situation in red where our distribution of growth rates across thousands of populations, which is what you're seeing here, is centered on a negative value, to conservation action that has shifted that distribution of change to one that's centered on 0. So we did an analysis to see if it was possible whether with today's knowledge we can detect that. I should be pointing over here. I don't know why I'm pointing at the screen. So what we did is we took one of the largest databases of population change called the Living Planet database, which is a remarkable database of literally thousands of, in fact, 30,000 vertebrate populations across 5,000 species from the period of 1970 to 2018. So you can see the map of those populations, and you'll notice there's a pattern again that looks a bit like the sort of geographic bias that we saw in the GBiF datasets. And what we did is a country level analysis where which is important because the GBF is focused on the nation state, I wanted to know whether we could detect change with the data we have for every country. But what we did is we created these clusters of information. So we had 480 country by taxa combinations. So for example, UK birds, UK mammals, UK fish, France birds, France mammals, France fish, etc., etc. So we created these systems that people are preoccupied by to see if we could detect extreme declines, and then whether we could detect recovery if by tomorrow, let's say, in a very rapid, under this thought experiment, we'd achieved successful conservation. And then we restricted our analysis to systems with greater than 10 populations, geographically speaking, because we wanted to have enough evidence. There's some minimal amount of evidence. All right. So, Andy. There we go. So what we're doing is we're building a statistical model that accounts for the variation within a population, the wiggle that we saw for the trends, and the variation in aggregate across all the populations. And that is that distribution that you see here. That's the distribution of population change across all populations. So we're using a particular type of model, a Bayesian hierarchical model here that allows us to calculate the average effect and then by population. And so the distribution that you get out of it tells you something about the uncertainty you have about where the average growth rate is, whether it's on zero, whether it's negative, or whether it's positive. And so that's great. We can fit this model to all of those populations, those 30,000 populations in the LPD, in the Living Planet database. And then the model allows us to assess risk. That is the severity of the population decline. So by what percentage per year is our population declining? And the probability that allows us to account for uncertainty in that rate of change that we collectively are happy to accept. Then what we do is we estimate the probability by taking the proportion of this distribution here of a certain growth rate that are declining at a certain rate. So in this case, it's declining at 1.5% per year. Let's say that's our critical threshold. And we can calculate the probability that that's happening by sort of integrating under this curve here to the left of that threshold. And then crucially, what we wanted to do is figure out where, how much statistical power, how much power we have to detect change when it's happening. So to reject the null hypothesis when it's false, and to discover whether change is happening when it's true. So this is one of the first times we feel that someone has actually asked the question that whether we have the resources and the data and the information at hand to know whether we could measure success under the GBF. So this first slide is showing you the number of systems. Remember, systems were taxa by country, declining. And that really, whether they're declining, depends upon the probability threshold that you are willing to set. So here is the number of systems, and here is the probability, and that is the decline. You can see the number of systems for which we have 95% confidence that they're declining is right here on the right. So 11 out of 198 systems are declining with 95% certainty. 11 systems are declining with 95% certainty. So that means that there are very few systems in the world where we can be sure, according to that criterion, that they're declining. But there are 37 systems that had at least a 70% chance of strong decline. So if we go to 70% here, 37% of those species, 37 systems, sorry, are declining with that degree of probability. So what does that mean? Well, it tells you that at some point, we collectively in society have to decide what risk we're prepared to accept, given the uncertainty about whether something is declining catastrophically or not. So that is under the precautionary principle, maybe it shouldn't be 95% certainty. Maybe it's 70% certainty. We have to decide what it is we want to use to inform action, where we should go in and act under the evidence that populations might be declining at that pretty catastrophic rate. And then the second part of this paper is we asked, okay, given this variability among populations and within populations, how much extra sampling do we have to do? How much extra monitoring do we need to do to be able to demonstrate that we can detect that recovery, that conservation thought experiment that I showed you? Do we have enough monitoring ability to detect the conservation outcome? So we only focus now on 62 systems for which we had good evidence that there was a decline of 1.5% per year. So in this graph, we're showing you the statistical power to detect that conservation outcome as a function of the number of populations that are sampled, going all the way up to 4,000. And here you're seeing lines that correspond to, in this case, birds in the United Arab Emirates, herps in Argentina, mammals in Panama, fish in Taiwan, and birds in Ghana. And what you're seeing here is that the systems where power increases quickly are those with which we had a 95% certainty of decline. So if you have lots of certainty that your populations are declining, then it's relatively easy to establish that conservation was successful. So you need to have good information about the state of your population if you want to be able to demonstrate conservation outcomes. But for 39 of those country systems, more than half, the statistical power to conclude with 95% confidence that populations had improved never exceeded 20%. So for the majority in this case, it's extremely hard, if not impossible, to demonstrate conservation recovery, even though it's happened, statistically speaking, in the model. So that is a concern. So we have some locations in the world where we have lots of good information, we have high certainty, and as you increase sampling, we have very high power to detect that we've reached our conservation goals. But for the majority, more than half, that is not possible. So let me summarize. So the number of systems that we infer to be declining depends upon the threshold that we set, the degree of satisfaction or the confidence we want to establish that decline is happening. So for trends of 1.5% per year, just 11 out of 198 systems are declining with 95% certainty. And 37 of those systems had a 70% chance of strong decline. So my question to you is, well, what's your willingness to accept catastrophic decline? Are you prepared to be 70% or a flick of a coin, 50%? That is a conversation we're not having in society. I think it's a conversation that the parties to the convention are not having about taking uncertainty very seriously and the evidence that's required to demonstrate change. The second question is, assuming immediate change, let's say immediate perfect outcome under conservation, can we detect it with more sampling? And the answer is basically no. We have to massively invest and upscale in our monitoring capability. We can increase detection with more monitoring. So either we monitor more populations or we extend our monitoring for those populations for which we've started monitoring. And I think crucially, we have to set a reference threshold. So in the absence of lots of information, the most effective statistical means to inform decisions is to set a reference threshold. So we set that at 1.5% decline per year. But each country is free to set that threshold for different organisms, different taxa, different measures of biodiversity. Now, I showed you that we can detect, it turns out that we can detect these populations are doing better than 1.5% per year with 70% certainty. So if we said that 70% is our criterion, then we can do quite a good job of showing recovery. And so under the precautionary principle, we need to adapt our criteria depending on the location in the organism. So this is a warning. Really, in some ways, it's a warning that current monitoring might not be sufficient. to know if our conservation actions are achieving the reversal of trends, bending the curve, statistically speaking. This uncertainty arises because of the high variability that we have in existing data, both in the trends and in incomplete knowledge of those trends. And there's no quick fix for that. We have to acknowledge this background level of uncertainty and work with it. We can do that by investing in smart monitoring in each country, raising the capacity of every country, especially those with relatively little information, to understand the timing of when we're going to see conservation outcomes that are consistent with our targets and goals. And I think we need to adopt this risk framework that climate science has done, but we haven't really done in biodiversity. So how are we going to meet this challenge? I've raised a flag. Turns out there are plenty of things we can do, not just statistically speaking, but I think we have to have the ambition to build something that's fit for purpose, that I'm calling a Global Biodiversity Observing System. And we've been calling for this. David, who's in the room here, has been called for this in 2006, but the biodiversity community has been calling for a coordination of institutions and governments and observing systems to build something that allows us to understand change in biodiversity. And this is this globally federated network of biodiversity observation networks that every country has. But what they're doing internally within the country is not necessarily coordinated with other countries. And this means that we have a gap. That in climate science, we have a UN framework, we have the IPCC producing reports on a regular basis, and they have global climate observing systems. But in biodiversity, we're lacking this piece of the puzzle. We have the UN CBD, we have a platform for assessing the evidence for biodiversity and ecosystem services, but we do not have a global biodiversity observing system. And so this is crucial. And what GeoBon is doing, the organization that I'm co-chair of, called the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network, recently proposed, which was the source of that Guardian article, a plan for lifting the capacity of our planet to measure biodiversity change that addresses some of these enormous geographic disparities, taxonomic disparities that we see in our global data sets. Let's try and do more monitoring in those places where we have very little data. And crucially, monitor with a view to action, not just monitoring passively, but doing so in a way that informs actions. So think about addressing the data gaps and inequities, crucially the data sovereignty, making sure that countries have their capacity to not only be in control of their data, but be able to use that data to measure progress towards the targets. Make sure that the science of the indicator workflows is available to everybody who needs it, and that we're doing monitoring for planning and action. And it's fair to say that we maybe not been doing monitoring in the best way, in the way that best supports action. So that is the paper we wrote. I tried to bring together as many people who had an opinion on this. There were more than 80 authors who felt that this might be a good idea and that this would be the seed for an initiative to do this. So what does that look like? How do we do it in a bottom-up way where everybody feels engaged in the process in monitoring, from citizen scientists to indigenous and local communities, municipalities, provinces and counties, and on up to nation states and regions? And so here is a cartoon of what this looks like. Is that here, this is for the country of Colombia, that is the poster child for an exceptionally smart and dedicated monitoring system for a hyperdiverse country, is that there are locations across that country where biodiversity is being monitored with a whole host of modern and traditional methods. And those locations, those sites of monitoring, are placed in areas where we want to understand the impact of different drivers, like deforestation, for example. And what happens is that when we build a BON, or a biodiversity observation network, we engage with all the stakeholders and rights holders in a country and bring them together around a table and ask, how do we want to realize our national biodiversity observation system? And then we assess our needs. So which technologies do we need? Where do we need to deploy monitoring? What kind of data services do we need? What kind of indicators should we calculate? And then we design this network in a way that's fit for the purpose of reporting on our progress under the goals and targets that the country has set. And then we implement that with funding from different levels, from philanthropy, from a government, from international organizations. And when we do that, we create a system that's designed for detecting those trends and addressing the uncertainties that I showed you in the previous part of the talk. So in the end, the country has something like a weather service. We're all used to getting an update on our phone about whether it's snowing or raining, the temperature, the wind speed. We need something equivalent to that we acknowledge is a vital part of what society needs to live in harmony with nature, is this biodiversity knowledge service. A service that's available to whoever needs it at the scale that they need it. And when we do that, and if every country is following these guidelines and building their BON, then we are able to share information and use that shared information to get this multi-scale understanding that I showed you at the outset, this geography of biodiversity change from the local scale to the regional scale, and then on up to the global scale, because we've coordinated that effort among countries. So that's the blueprint for this Global Biodiversity Observing System. And this Global Biodiversity Observing System would produce images, maps like this, among other things, where countries have stitched together their understanding, in this case, for example, of nature's contributions to people. And so we would then be informed in a way that's not geographically biased, where every country has access to that information to inform conservation action. And so GeoBon, over the last 15 years, has been working towards this vision by working with countries to build national bonds. And so GeoBon is in there are 3,500 experts in 150 countries, and several countries have been spearheading this process of building a bond. That's great. It's the beginning of an inner circle, a kind of coalition of the willing who are prepared to work together to share knowledge and understanding. And then GeoBon has also been working with what we call thematic bonds. Marine bond, soil bond, freshwater bond, and regional bonds like Europa bond and Asia Pacific bond. So with relatively modest means, we've been able to assemble the pieces of this puzzle, the national units or bonds, the science in these thematic bonds, and then create this regional structure that allows different countries, in this case 13 countries in the Asia Pacific region, to work together. So that is an optimistic view, and I'm super encouraged by how this is working right now. And we're seeing an uptick in countries wanting to build their bond. So I'm going to skip that one. So what we are looking to create by 2050, this fit-for-purpose global biodiversity observing system that is linking our understanding of biodiversity change, thanks to this international network of networks that tells us how biodiversity is changing at these different scales across the essential biodiversity variables, allows us to assess progress towards our targets under the convention, supporting a transfer of knowledge on a almost near real time that can support the assessment processes done by IPBES and others, to then inform policy action for conservation. And will be achieved because we've created this international network of collaboration and coordination among the key institutions, whether that's in situ or Earth observation, and the deployment of different technologies that allow us to understand biodiversity change multilaterally. So that's the kind of the vision where we want to be. My task for the next 18 months as co-chair, as I exit the role, is to try to find the funding for this thing, and also kind of find the co-sponsorship and governance model. In climate science, they have the World Meteorological Organization that does all the heavy lifting. We have to build cooperation with the UNCBD and its partners, partner institutions, and do so in a way is built on the knowledge that's brought together under the IPBES assessment that's currently ongoing, that I'm co-chairing, on monitoring the different resources and the capacities we have to monitor biodiversity and ecosystem services, or nature's contributions to people. One solution is to create something called a Systematic Observations Financing Facility. That's a mouthful, the SOF. Climate Science built a SOF, a fund that is given to different countries that need an uplift, that need an investment in their capacity to monitor. And it's an effort to equalize the disparities among countries in their capacity to monitor biodiversity. So I think with the Global Environment Facility, we might be able to build something that looks like this, that will allow us to realize the vision of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Okay, I'm going to run out of time. So I'm going to give you the highlights in the last 5 or 6 minutes, 8 minutes, of maybe I've told you a bit of both an initially gloomy story, that we're going to struggle to detect the change even if we've achieved our conservation goals. So we must invest in our ability to understand and observe nature. And in the second part, kind of a blueprint for how we might solve that problem. Now I want to talk to you about action, about the other part of my work, which has been about trying to bend the curve in Canada for the goals around habitat connectivity. That is ensuring the recovery of the ability of organisms, of animals, to move, and plants over different timescales, to move freely through landscapes and seascapes. And you'll see that connectivity, wonderfully, is sewn in to multiple targets. It's in Goal A, it's in Goal B as well. And so this is critical that we understand how connectivity has been changing, and also deploying the science that allows us to bend the curve of connectivity. So we have a paper coming out soon that provides kind of a framework to answer the question, well, what is well-connected anyway? You can ask different people and you might have different answers for what well-connected means, and well-connected might differ whether it's genetic diversity, population, communities, ecosystems. And so we think about protecting and restoring connectivity, but it always happens in a broader social context where there are different landholders and stakeholders and rights holders. And we have to think about planning, understanding the context, defining our objectives, and monitoring, crucially, that we're achieving our goals. And it's that iterative cycle of science, policy, co-design, and co-development of a connectivity strategy that'll get us to this bending the curve of connectivity. And why would we do that? Because we get a lot of benefits from that. So preserving the ecological and evolutionary legacy of our biota in those regions, natural climate solutions that arise from connected systems, and the social, cultural, and economic well-being that we get when we consider connectivity. So by connectivity, we mean the extent, rate, and configuration of movements of organisms and the flows of energy and biomass and matter and genes. And we can think about it again, the common theme of this talk, at different scales. We can act on connectivity at a very small scale, or at a landscape scale, or a continental scale, by thinking about protecting migration pathways. But also under the Convention for Migratory Species, can we protect wetlands in different parts of a continent to ensure stopover sites and connectivity? And then we've got various mechanisms, different tools that we have between policy and engineering that allow us to change connectivity. Now, one of the things that happens in global analyses of connectivity is that we see maps like this that show us solutions for what's called the global safety net. And one of those solutions in the global safety net is connectivity. Where should we put our corridors to ensure that things are connected planetarily speaking? And one of the frustrating things about these global analyses is they're not very well adapted to local needs. So you'll see this is where I'm living. This is the city of Montreal in the south of Quebec. And you'll see that this analysis for the global safety net proposes 1, 2, 3 corridors. This is from the US into the kind of the Appalachians, into the Laurentians. And you'll see there are three corridors. One is a dead end. One finishes in a lake. and the other one doesn't even get to cross the lake. So this global analysis that's not finally resolved, is not considering local requirements, is completely inappropriate to guide local action. So what I've been doing over the last 15 years has been working with the provincial government, working with NGOs, working with municipalities to try to update those global analyses, downscale those recommendations about where we should act. And so I started off by working at the scale of the eco-region. So there's the city of Montreal. This is the size of Switzerland. Canada's a big place. That's one eco-region, Quebec City, Montreal. And what we've been doing is I'm going to show you, we've been deploying connectivity science to prioritize on a map where conservation NGOs and other actors, municipalities and the provincial government, could act to protect connectivity. This lime green is showing you those corridors that we would suggest would augment those global recommendations. We're now doing this upscaling, so we create a plan for a connected protected area network, which you see in green here. Those are all the protected areas in Quebec. How do you ensure that they are well connected? We've been helping the city of Montreal do that with its green space, and the 80-odd municipalities in the greater Montreal region of the city. And I ended up, after 15 years, deciding to start a company. I couldn't do it within my own lab. I just didn't have the alacrity of the ability to respond to the knowledge need that was overwhelming as soon as I started providing this science to guide conservation action. And Habitat, as it's called, not the company in the UK that sells couches and curtains. And Habitat now provides the tools to the private sector, to businesses, to towns and citizens to do the kinds of analysis that's appropriate to the scale of action. So we apply this connectivity science in three broad steps. I don't really have the time to go into those steps, but I just want to show you this piece here. And then I'll show you a few maps and then I'll wrap up. So what goes into this loop that I showed you earlier on, this theory of change about how you co-design connectivity and how do you link it to action and monitoring? So what we do is we start with the species and the ecosystems that we want to protect. So we want to protect, let's say, deciduous forest in the south of Quebec, and there's a whole host of forest species we're concerned about. So by working with experts, we can identify the habitats that these species need, where they are in the ecoregion, use different measures of functional connectivity, so how the species move through the landscape, prioritize the action, where should we go first, what efforts are needed, and then use maps of ecosystem extent and condition to modify our scenarios for land use change so that in the future, we account for change to mitigate or stave off a worsening of connectivity. So we use models of habitat change, of land use change. We bring in regional climate scenarios to understand how species are responding to those. And we iterate this over and over until we produce maps for the next century of how we expect, it's like a forecast or a prediction of how connectivity will change that's needed for actors trying to realize our connectivity goals. So here is a map of how we expect urban area to sprawl over the next century. This is the city of Montreal, that's Quebec City. And each species perceives the impact of the loss of connectivity, whether it's a shrew, an American marten, a salamander, a frog, or a bear, very differently. So this is where if we're going to protect connectivity for multiple species, we have to understand how this change is impacting those different species and coming up with a strategy for them. And so now we can project the future of connectivity. Areas of high connectivity are shown in yellow here, over decade after decade, and see how, for example, the sprawl of Montreal is impacting connectivity for those species in different ways. So now, instead of showing lots of geeky maps, what we do is when we work with an NGO or a regional government, we show a dynamic map of the probability of movement. So here you're seeing these little vectors of movement for different species in our system and how our model predicts movement change in those locations. Those maps are super informative for where to act and what to protect. And then over the next century, we look at the long-term fate of connectivity change for each species under different scenarios of action. And that informs more action. And lastly, we have these dashboards that help NGOs figure out where to act first, how to prioritize, there's a little bit of French there, high, low, medium, return on your conservation investment for connectivity. And as I said, now we're going up from the corridors that we've helped plan for this ecoregion through this methodology on up to the entire province. So I'm going to wrap up now with some answers to the questions I started out with. We need, remember those 3 questions? Well, in answer to that, we need a robust multi-scale implementation of the UN CBD framework so that countries can assess their progress and they have the sovereignty and the capacity to do that themselves. I think we can do this by assembling a global biodiversity observing system. And then we need to apply the knowledge, this biodiversity science that we have for different areas to support not only an understanding of change, the causes of that change, but how we're going to act on those drivers and align action at those different spatial scales to achieve the goals and targets of the global biodiversity framework. I want to thank the folks in my lab who are the brilliant minds behind a lot of the information, the analysis I've shown you, and thank you all for your attention.
Both a fantastic world tour, but actually that work of connectivity is really, really exciting to see as well. We'll open up to questions now, but actually before we do that, perhaps I thought maybe reflecting on some of our discussions over the last day, what do you think the UK and perhaps Oxford need to do to support this effort to have biodiversity monitoring up to scratch to meet these goals?
The UK is one of those examples of countries that has an enormous wealth of biodiversity information for a whole range of plants and animals. And there's a long history of being interested in understanding where our birds and butterflies are. And so there is a remarkably coordinated network of monitoring. But the UK has not so far been a particularly important player in the conversation about how do we support this global or international effort. And so I see an enormous opportunity for institutions like this one to work with other hubs or nodes in the UK network to engage in that bond process that I showed you for Colombia, right? So you assess the need, you create an authorizing environment, then you begin the process of designing what the UK system would be like to share that knowledge with other countries, and then you would implement that process. If we can do that, then I think we have this remarkable opportunity not only to further the UK's capacity to understand change across all those different dimensions of biodiversity and different scales, but also it can be a key player in that global network of that GBiOS network that I was talking about. So I think really there's a lot of a remarkable landscape situated projects in the UK, and they're kind of these living laboratories of learning about how action needs to change and outcomes to understand biodiversity trends, as I started out my talk with. And I think if we start aggregating that knowledge, right, just through the different projects that are happening around the UK, if we could aggregate that understanding, we would know collectively how we're doing in the UK to bend the curve of biodiversity. And I think that's we need a kind of a sea change of how we connect things and how we connect the science to the action.
Thank you. Okay, we can open up to questions.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. That's really cool. The one bit I was like less clear on is, so you have this broad vision. Is the vision more about detecting change, so monitoring biodiversity trends, or is it more about attributing that change? So actually saying this was due to this one conservation action, or this was due to this improvement in management? Is it more about the attributing or more about the detecting change in this kind of vision of the global biodiversity network?
Great question. You saw the word attribution loitering in various slides. A year and a half ago, I proposed that biodiversity science needs a detection and attribution framework. that we're quite good in biodiversity about telling the story of decline or recovery. We detect the change. Can't do it internationally very well. We have a good global picture, but in certain parts of the world, we do have some strong statistical evidence that change happens. But we have very little evidence that we're acting on the underlying drivers. We've attributed the outcome to the action on the causes of change. And because those causes are interacting, climate change, interacting with habitat loss, interacting with invasive species, interacting with pollution and pesticides, that's a complex thing. And so what I propose is that we begin to make statements of attribution based on the causal models that we can build, that we understand how those relationships among drivers and biodiversity outcomes are interconnected, and that our monitoring estimates those causal models. And those are the basis for action. You act based on your understanding of the causes. You understand that it's complex, it's uncertain. But until we do that, I fear that we're sticking our finger in the wind and trying to figure out which way the wind is blowing. In climate science, they've been very committed to this attribution step. And I think if we can do that, then we can make much stronger statements about investment in conservation action, because we can demonstrate that the action we impose has been due to the action on the cause.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Thank you. I'm wondering though, whether in terms of biodiversity monitoring, whether your approach is too complicated. It's a bit of a challenge.
I like challenges.
Especially to bring the public with it. I mean, you've noted citizen scientists, etc., but that's collecting the data, and then the experts crunch it.
Yeah.
So in terms of the public understanding how you're getting to your conclusions, which seems to be a particularly important question at this moment in the world, could you consider a simpler statistical approach? I don't know. I'm not a statistician, but chi-square tests, or a categorical approach like we use in this country for biodiversity net gain monitoring. So inference from habitat change. So you monitor the habitats and then infer from that what's happening. More categorical. So that's the question really, is could this be simpler? I know you'd lose something doing that, but you could bring a lot of politicians and public with you.
Yeah, well, this is a really important point, and there are 2 points to my answer. So the monitoring framework of the GBF was a negotiated process that identified indicators. So simple measures of outcomes that we want to achieve, right? So for example, how many species there might be on your red list could be a measure of how many threatened species there are in your country, right? So that's just, okay, how many species are there? Which ones are there? Have they come off your list, or are they on your list? The other one is the Living Planet Index. So I didn't calculate the Living Planet Index. I calculated something that was more fundamental, which is the change in populations. Now, I think many of us are exposed to this idea of R0 during the pandemic, this idea that something's increasing. Well, that's the opposite of that. So I think we can convey, it's important that what we convey is simple, but without losing what's behind it, which is the science we need to have confidence that the simple indicator and the conclusion we're getting from that simple indicator is based on the best possible science, the most robust statistical knowledge. You wouldn't dream of producing a macroeconomic model. You wouldn't, we can give simple measures of the state of an economy, inflation, interest rates, whatever it is, but we have the science behind it. And I think that's the same kind of argument. I think we have a diagnosis, it simplifies the problem for a stakeholder. And then, yes, we're recovering or we're not. We're achieving our restoration outcomes or we're not. But to be convincing about that, I still think we need to have the science behind it. And that's fundamentally what the monitoring framework is doing. What I was showing you here is that maybe we've been a bit slow in providing the foundational science. Nick.
Thanks, Andy. So you talked a lot about the kinds of challenges, particularly the institutional challenges and bringing people together and so on. You talked relatively little about the science challenges, a little bit on the statistics, but
Yeah.
perhaps you could elaborate more on what you see as the challenges that what does biodiversity science have to do in
Yeah.
order to do a better job?
Yeah, great question. And that comes back a little bit to the attribution question. So the biggest challenge I see right now is that the causes of change, not only are they interaction, climate change, habitat loss, but the strength of their interaction changes with your scope, your field of view. So if you have a Europe-wide policy, and then you have national policies, so you've got a Europe strategy for biodiversity, then you've got a national strategy for biodiversity, these might not be perfectly aligned. Right? So for example, I was in the context of a CBD ad hoc expert group on indicators. I was talking to a colleague who is concerned about biodiversity in Barbados. And she said, the primary thing I'm interested in is invasive species. And I want to be able to measure the impact of invasive species. So she wanted to understand all the indicators related to that. How do we understand not only the arrival of invasive species, but also how do we measure their impact? Okay, that's a particular focus. It's very important for that country. But another country in the Caribbean or elsewhere in the region might be interested in another set of things. So the science needs to figure out this geography of biodiversity change, the underlying causes of that geography, how our appreciation of action at one scale leads to outcomes at another scale, this sort of emergent understanding of that. So connectivity is a good example. You figure out the structure of your landscape or your seascape, and then you get these emergent benefits because you've acted on multiple levels at the same time. And I think we're a bit, the pace at which knowledge leaves the primary literature, the sort of fundamental biodiversity science, is too slow. It doesn't get into actionable terms for, we're talking 20 to 25 years. And I think we have to massively shorten the time it takes for that knowledge to get into the hands of, in this case, the complexity of the scales and interacting drivers into the hands of whoever the actor is, whether that's a conservation NGO or a provincial government or a municipality. Municipalities are one of the most interested in that company that I started. And they go, how do I take this GBF and downscale it to my city that has an invasive insect, that has flooding problems, that has heat waves, and the city wants to be able to solve that problem. And it sees all this complexity, but doesn't know how to address it, using this relatively simple indicators that convey to the citizens of that city that they're making progress. So this scaling issue is super challenging. I think we can do much more. There and there. That's Joe. Hi, Joe.
Hi. Yeah, lots of fantastic stuff in there and huge challenges, as you say. Most of it addresses the parts of the GBF text which are species focused.
Yes.
But of course, there's a lot of it which is ecosystem functions and services.
Yes.
And I was just wondering where we're at in terms of the monitoring framework and how it can bridge across from the biodiversity data to implications for functions, ecological processes, etc.
Great question. So there is a risk that so goal B is sort of benefits to people, contributions of nature to people, and how do we manage? And a lot of those are functions that we care about, either culturally, relationally, or economically. And in many cases, the species part, the biological diversity part, at the organismal level is responsible, as you know, for the rate processes, the stocks, and the functions that we rely upon. And there is a risk that we silo goal A and progress on goal B. And we just focus on saving threatened species, recovering populations, without doing so in a way that also maintains our focus on the functions of those ecosystems. So in the GeoBond framework, we have these essential biodiversity variables. And our community has spent so much time thinking about one variable at a time that it's forgotten to look at the intersection between the EBVs. And as you know, we've spent the last 30 years in a field called biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, where we've been trying to show that causally changing in biodiversity has an impact on the functioning of an ecosystem. All that knowledge is sitting there in the literature, but it's not necessarily making its way into conservation recommendations, where you're acting both on the biodiversity, the functional diversity of that system, protecting threatened species, but ensuring that those processes, these ecological processes and functions are being maintained. And connectivity is one of those cross-cutting things that I think is vital for doing both. So we need to do much more of the intersection among these variables. Normally I have a slide that shows that how we can do that. And I know the work that you've done on this, and I think that we need, as a community, this is coming back to this first question about how institutionally we can do more to gather our knowledge and then put it into a form that can be taken up. I think there's a question at the back.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was a really interesting talk. At various points, you mentioned sampling bias, particularly early on in the talk, but then it wasn't quite clear to me where that fits in when we got to the power analysis part. So to me, the sampling bias would have a big effect on the magnitude or the mean of that distribution of trends. So obviously, that that has a big impact on power. Is that something you thought about? Is that something you might think about in future?
Yeah, well, it is super important because we don't know how representative those samples are. Those population dynamics are we don't the historical reasons why we selected those populations to be monitored aren't a random subset of all the things we could have monitored. They're not representative, and I think it sounds like you're statistically smart, so you know what I'm talking about. So I'm conscious that those biases are not only true spatially and geographically, but our understanding of change, the dynamics of change, the risk, are skewed because of the places we've gone and studied. And I'll give you an example. In the breeding bird survey in North America, we have all these routes. Those routes were laid down initially because we wanted to discover as many species as possible. They weren't laid down to do the attribution piece, meaning we didn't lay down routes to figure out whether deforestation or mining or whatever it is was causally responsible for the change in breeding birds. So now we've got these beautiful data sets, but they don't really give you the full picture of the dynamics of change. And in fact, it turns out that people stop going to those routes when someone puts a Walmart car park or something, I'm using, a Waitrose car park or something in that location. So now you've got another bias that we stop studying in those places where we should keep studying. So coming back, I don't know if it was Nick's challenge about what do we mean by biodiversity change? Well, we mean more than the trend in the mean, and we also mean more than the variance. We also mean something about the structure of the autocorrelation of those changes that are crucial to getting the trend estimate right. So that's a great question. Helen, in the middle there.
Yeah, thank you for a great and comprehensive talk.
Thank you.
I've been thinking about timescales throughout it. So what you're aligning is something that's very ambitious. And at the beginning, when you mentioned the number of countries or nations or areas for which we have sufficient data at the moment to make any kind of inference about anything, regardless of attribution, etc., and it's so small. And then you propose a fantastic framework. Framework to get there. But do we have time to get to that point? And what would be the priorities within your framework that, so for example, it would be great if you could compel every nation to create the bond in the box, but what would be the priority for them? Are you imagining that they're all sitting on a lot of data already that could be mobilized, and that would be the kind of priority, that sort of head start for them, or what is it within that framework that's a priority?
Pragmatism. The best time to start a monitoring framework was 20 years ago. The next best time is tomorrow. It's not because we don't have the right information at hand that we shouldn't do it. But we can't start with complete pie in the sky. So under this GEF 9, the Global Biodiversity Call, this is the first time that I was contacted by them representing GeoBond's framework, and they said that they would like to use this GeoBond framework to structure how they would invest that $100 million. So let's say there's $100 million goes to 196 parties to lift their capacity. Okay, how do we do that? Everyone would recognize the need, if only for statistically reasons, but there are many other reasons why you should engage civil society in understanding nature change. So what I would do is I'd have this very pragmatic process where the guidance document that GeoBond produces on how to build your bond is made accessible to everybody. You would fund workshops and engage civil engagement processes and connect to the existing data sources within country. I'll give you an example, an anecdote that I probably told yesterday that everyone understands. I was chatting to the focal point for Egypt at COP15, and he goes, "Oh, you're Andy Gonzalez. It's nice to meet you. You help. What is this GeoBond thing?" I said, "Oh, GeoBond helps understand how to redeploy the monitoring framework and understand biodiversity change and help to report on the indicator." He said, "Andy, that's great. I love the framework. But here is the resources that I have. I have an intern and an Excel spreadsheet. That is all I have to calculate the indicators of the monitoring framework. 23 headline indicators, some of which aren't even mathematically established yet. So anything we give him and that ministry, $100,000, would pay for a human being, an instance of bond in a box. And I think we can begin to raise the level in a way that isn't thinking about, 100 billion and trying to create this bespoke system that climate science has built over the last 50 years. So to your question, I think let's start immediately. These funds are going to flow. There are several funds available to countries. And I think we have to be realistic about what can be achieved over the coming year or two. But I'm not trying to build something for 2030. I hate to admit that. I think we start down the road, and that by 2030, we're in a position where many countries have a much greater capacity to measure their progress to the 2050 goals. If we spend the next 5 years raising the level, then we got a chance of quantifying progress, reporting progress, and telling society that actually, yes, this biodiversity thing is on the mend.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap up.
Given that there's limited funding for supporting the biodiversity crisis and
Yes.
changing the curve, do you have any concerns that the monitoring is taking funding away from action? And I know, well, it's, two different things, but.
Great question, and a reoccurring question. I think sometimes there is a risk that monitoring is diverting funds away from actual outcomes. I think in fact, there are notions in science, in decision theoretic context, where we can try to understand what's the appropriate investment and balance that investment so that it's providing enough evidence, enough understanding of the uncertainties, that the monitoring is not just this passive thing that helps us understand whether the butterfly is going extinct, but it's done in a way that's directed to understanding the causes so that you can be more effective in the action. So I think we have to be what I would calling smart monitoring, is where you're aligning that monitoring with the conservation needs, and you're calculating this value of the information that you're gathering. Is that value of information truly valuable? Especially if your monitoring was designed 20, 30 years ago. The underpinning reasons why you were doing that might have changed in your area. And so if you can update that now under this new impetus and be more effective, then I think we can go back to a policymaker and say, no, it allows us to be more effective in our conservation action. I'll just close with the thing that no back of the envelope calculation has been done. I'm looking at David because he's responsible for how much money will be needed to implement the monitoring framework. We haven't asked the question, is it 5% of the global investment in conservation action? Is it 10? Is it 20? And so I think there's something for us to do to figure out region by region, what would be that minimum investment? And then we can say to people, that's the ask. We can raise it philanthropically, we can raise it through a public state, we can raise it with all sorts of different mechanisms. But until we ask that question, until we mobilize that capacity, I fear that we will continue maybe to not justify the money that goes into monitoring effectively. Great.
Fantastic.
Thanks,
So
Edwin.
thank you for a really interesting discussion there as well. And we're just having drinks around the corner, so do feel free to carry on with an informal conversation there. So thanks once again.
My pleasure. Thanks, Edwin.